Good evening. We're coming back on the air at this hour because there's been a development in the search for Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, with assistance from the FBI, has detained an individual at this hour for questioning in connection with the abduction of Nancy Guthrie. Again, a person detained in connection with this case.
Yeah, Trim and Troy, good afternoon to you both. You may remember Friday night. This was a big night in this investigation when very late at night, law enforcement were executing a search warrant here in the Catalina foothills area. It was this home just over my shoulder. It's only about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's own home.
89 days. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been gone. 89 days of silence. 89 days of unanswered questions. 89 days of a family holding their breath in front of television cameras while privately begging for any word, any sign, any trace of an 84-year-old woman who walked out of her life in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, and simply never came back. And for 89 days, the public watched. They watched law enforcement cast a wide net across the desert. They watched federal agents move through that quiet, sun-bleached neighborhood with a focus that told you this was no ordinary missing persons case. They watched a 7-figure reward go unclaimed. They watched Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable faces in American television, a woman who sits behind the Today Show desk every single morning, carry the unbearable weight of not knowing what happened to her mother. Most people assumed the case had gone cold. They were wrong, because while the public was watching the surface, something was happening underneath. Something slow, something surgical, something that federal investigators had been quietly constructing for weeks inside sealed laboratories and classified briefing rooms, away from cameras, away from press conferences, and away from the kind of noise that tips off the wrong people. And now, a name has surfaced. Not from a tip line. Not from a reward collar with a story to sell. From the evidence itself. From the kind of forensic convergence that seasoned investigators describe as the moment a case stops being a search and starts becoming a pursuit. That name is Tommaso. And what connects Tommaso to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is not speculation. It is not a rumor circulating on social media. It is a thread, a specific, documented, investigative thread, that law enforcement has been pulling on with increasing intensity.
Well, new Ring camera video from a Catalina foothills home just blocks away from Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood making the rounds online tonight. And it was taken just last night, showing a masked person in gloves walking up a private driveway in the middle of the night and taking a potted cacti. News 4 Tucson's Jacob Owens joins us from the foothills with why this video, Jacob, is causing some concern tonight.
Every pull has revealed more. Every revelation has tightened the picture. And right now, that picture is coming into focus in a way that changes everything about how this case is understood. Hi viewers, Nancy Guthrie has now been missing for nearly 90 days. Do you think an arrest is coming soon? Yes or no? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because here is what you need to understand before anything else. The Catalina foothills is not a neighborhood where people disappear. It sits in the northern edge of Tucson. Quiet streets carved into the desert hillside, high walls, private driveways, security cameras on every corner. It is the kind of place where an 84-year-old woman should be safe. Where the biggest concern on any given Tuesday should be the heat or the traffic on Skyline Drive. It is the kind of neighborhood where nothing like this is supposed to happen. And yet, Nancy Guthrie was last seen at her home in those foothills. No struggle reported, no witnesses. No clear point of exit that the public has been made aware of. Just a woman, a mother, a grandmother, the quiet force behind one of the most prominent families in American media, gone. Vanished from the place she was supposed to be most protected. Law enforcement responded quickly. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, led by Sheriff Chris Nanos, launched an investigation that expanded almost immediately beyond the local level. The FBI entered the case. That alone told the people paying close attention something critical. The FBI does not deploy its resources, its personnel, or its specialized forensic infrastructure on cases that look simple from the inside.
It was less than a mile from Nancy Guthrie's home here in the foothills. It's a neighborhood that's been on edge for weeks and actually months. Tomorrow marks 90 days since Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home here in the foothills, and that's 3 months. So a video surfacing of a man in a mask on private property is raising some surprise with a neighbor I spoke with.
Their presence was a signal. This was complicated, this was layered, and this was far from over. In the early days, investigators established a search radius 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. That radius was not arbitrary. It was calculated, shaped by evidence recovery patterns, probable suspect movement corridors, and the kind of behavioral mapping that federal analysts use to reconstruct how a crime was planned and executed. Within that 2-mile zone, something had already been found. Something that would quietly become the most important piece of physical evidence in the entire investigation. A pair of black gloves. Discarded. Found 2 miles from Nancy's front door. And on those gloves, DNA. Male DNA. From more than one person. Stop and think about what that means. Those gloves were not left by accident. They served a purpose. They were worn by someone who understood that bare hands leave evidence. Someone who planned. Someone who knew enough to cover their tracks, and still left something behind. That single detail reframes the entire nature of this case. This was not impulsive. This was not random. Whoever was involved in what happened to Nancy Guthrie came prepared. And now Tommaso's name is being connected to what happened in those foothills. The investigation did not reach his name by accident either. Federal investigations of this scale do not work on coincidence. They work on convergence. The point where geography, forensic evidence, surveillance data, and behavioral analysis all begin pointing in the same direction. That convergence is what brought Tommaso into this case. And once his name entered the investigative frame, the questions surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance stopped being about whether there would be a breakthrough. They became about how long Tommaso thought he could stay invisible. Because here is the thing about federal investigations. They are not built for speed. They are built for certainty. Every step, every warrant, every detention, every laboratory result, all of it is moving toward a single destination. A prosecution that cannot be dismantled. A case so forensically layered that no defense attorney, no matter how skilled, can find a clean way out. The public sees silence and assumes stagnation. Investigators see silence and call it construction. And right now, everything being constructed in this case has begun to point toward one man. The forensic evidence is evolving. The digital reconstruction is underway. The genealogical analysis of that mixed DNA profile from the black gloves is ongoing in multiple laboratories simultaneously. And Tommaso, whose connection to this case is no longer theoretical, is sitting at the center of it all. The question is not whether investigators know something. The question is how much they already know that they have chosen not to say. And that question leads somewhere much darker than most people are prepared to go. Tommaso Balbo. That is the name that has entered this investigation like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples are still moving outward, and every ripple is carrying something heavier than the one before it. To understand why his connection to this case matters, you have to understand who Tommaso Balbo is. Not who he presents himself to be. Not the version of himself that existed before investigators started pulling on that thread. But who he actually is in the context of this case, this neighborhood, and this disappearance. Tommaso Balbo is an Italian national. A man whose world, on the surface, looked nothing like the world of organized criminal activity that federal investigators typically pursue. But surface appearances are exactly what sophisticated criminal planning relies on. The ability to look ordinary. The ability to move through spaces without triggering alarm. The ability to be present in places where presence alone is not yet evidence. And Tommaso Balbo was present. That is the detail that matters. Not in a peripheral, coincidental way. In a way that placed him within the gravitational pull of the very geography that law enforcement had already identified as the center of this investigation. The Catalina foothills. That 2-mile radius. The same zone where those black gloves were found. The same corridor that the FBI had been canvassing with surveillance requests and warrant applications since the earliest days of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance.
It is someone walking on your property late at night, uninvited, committing, it might be a small crime, but committing a crime, and it is disturbing. It drives the point home that we have to be watchful, be aware of our homes, but also of our neighbors.
Geography in criminal investigations is never just background. It is evidence. When a person's known movements, associations, and physical presence repeatedly intersect with the specific coordinates that investigators have already flagged as operationally significant, that intersection stops being coincidence. It becomes a data point. And when data points accumulate around a single individual, the investigative focus sharpens in a way that is very difficult to walk back from. Something placed Tommaso Balbo inside that operational radius. And federal agents do not begin connecting names to active kidnapping investigations unless something concrete justifies it. Think about that for a moment. The FBI had already been involved in this case for weeks. They had already executed coordinated search warrants. They had already seized physical evidence. They had already been running forensic analysis on biological material recovered from the scene. For a new name to surface at this stage of the investigation, that name had to have been pulled in by the evidence, not by rumor, not by public pressure, and not by the kind of investigative desperation that produces false leads. Tommaso Balbo's name came from the work. Now consider the behavioral dimension. One of the most consistent findings in high-profile abduction cases is that the individuals involved are not strangers to the operational environment. They do not stumble into complex crimes. They walk into them with a level of familiarity that takes time to build. Familiarity with the target's routines. Familiarity with the neighborhood's rhythms. Familiarity with the windows of vulnerability that exist in any person's daily life if you watch closely enough and long enough. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills. She had a routine. She had a home. She had a life that, from the outside, followed predictable patterns. And someone, or more than one someone, had been paying attention to those patterns long before the night she disappeared. That level of pre-operational awareness does not develop overnight. It requires proximity. It requires patience. It requires a connection to the environment that a random, unrelated individual simply does not have. When investigators began mapping Tommaso Balbo's known connections against the geography and timeline of this case, what they found was not the profile of someone completely unrelated to what happened in those foothills. It was something else entirely. And here is where the investigation deepens in a way that most people following this case have not yet grasped. Because the connection between Tommaso Balbo and this disappearance is not a single thread. It is a web, a series of intersecting data points that, taken individually, might be explained away. But taken together, in the way that federal investigators are trained to take them together, they form a picture that is very hard to ignore. His movements during the critical window surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance did not reflect the pattern of an uninvolved person. Uninvolved people do not alter their behavior. They do not change their routines. They do not suddenly shift the way they communicate, where they go, or how they interact with the people around them. Guilty awareness changes behavior, and behavioral changes, when they align precisely with the timeline of a crime, become one of the most powerful signals an investigator can follow. Tommaso Balbo's behavior shifted. The calm that surveillance captured, the kind of deliberate, measured stillness that investigators noted in the movements associated with this case, is not the calm of innocence. It is something harder to name. A practiced composure. A discipline that does not come naturally to people who have never operated under the weight of criminal exposure. That kind of calm has a history behind it, and federal agents are currently tracing that history with everything they have. But here is the detail that stops this from being just another investigative thread chased down and abandoned. Here is what makes Tommaso Balbo's connection to this case different from the other names that drifted in and out of the investigation during those first painful weeks. Sheriff Chris Nanos, a man who has been extraordinarily deliberate with every single public statement he has made since Nancy Guthrie disappeared, has publicly cleared other individuals connected to this case by name. He cleared Nancy's family members. He cleared people whose names were circulating on social media. He stood in front of cameras and said, explicitly, that specific individuals were not suspects. He has not done that for Tommaso Balbo. That silence is not an oversight. In a case this high profile, with this level of federal involvement, nothing is accidental. Every word the sheriff chooses to say, and every word he chooses not to say, is a calculated decision made in coordination with federal prosecutors and the FBI. When a man's name enters the active investigative frame of a federal kidnapping case and the lead law enforcement official refuses to offer the public reassurance that he is cleared, that refusal is itself a statement.
Monica, again, this is a good reminder for people who live in this neighborhood to check their doorbell cameras or Ring cameras, because the Pima County Sheriff's Department, now nearly 3 months into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, is continuing to ask people to submit any relevant footage to the case. Reporting live in the foothills, Jacob Owens, News 4 Tucson.
The loudest statement in this entire investigation has no words at all. And it is pointed directly at Tommaso Balbo. Now here is the question that should be keeping everyone connected to this case wide awake at night. If Tommaso Balbo's connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has been documented well enough to place him inside the active federal investigation, what else has been documented that has not yet been made public? Because what investigators reveal is always a fraction of what they actually hold. The visible surface of any major federal case represents maybe 10% of the total evidentiary picture. The other 90% is sealed, classified, and being carefully prepared for a courtroom that may be closer than anyone realizes. The connection has been made. The question now is how far it goes. And the answer to that question lives inside the forensic evidence. Evidence that is currently being processed in laboratories that do not operate on the public's timeline, do not respond to social media pressure, and do not release their findings until every single result has been locked, verified, and made prosecution ready. The forensic story of this case is the most important story that has not been fully told yet. And it starts with those gloves. Those black gloves found 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home were not just physical evidence. They were a message that the person who left them never intended to send. Every pair of gloves worn during a crime traps the biological material of the wearer inside its lining. Skin cells, perspiration, microscopic traces of hair. The very biology that a person uses gloves to conceal becomes preserved by those same gloves the moment they are discarded. Whoever wore those gloves left themselves behind. And the DNA recovered from those gloves, male DNA from more than one contributor, is now at the center of one of the most forensically complex analysis operations that this investigation has produced. A mixed biological sample is not a simple problem. It cannot be processed through a standard database query and resolved in an afternoon. Mixed profiles require the kind of meticulous laboratory separation that takes months of isolating individual genetic markers, ruling out contamination, and building a profile that is legally bulletproof before it can be used in court. That process is happening right now. But here is what makes it even more significant in the context of Tommaso Balbo's connection to this case. The FBI is not relying on CODIS alone. CODIS, the federal DNA database, only identifies individuals who have already submitted a sample through prior criminal processing. If a contributor to that mixed profile has never been arrested and processed, a standard database search returns nothing. So investigators turn to something far more powerful: forensic genealogy, the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer after decades of failure. The same tool that has closed cold cases that traditional forensics could not crack. Forensic genealogy does not require a suspect's DNA to be in any government database. Instead, it builds backward through family trees, searching for distant relatives, shared ancestral markers, biological cousins 2 and 3 generations removed, and then constructs a lineage map that eventually narrows to a specific individual. If Tommaso Balbo's biological family carries markers that intersect with the DNA profile recovered from those gloves, it does not matter whether his own sample has ever been collected by law enforcement. The science will find him anyway. And beyond the DNA, there's the vehicle. The white Range Rover seized by federal agents on February 13, 2024, from a Culver's parking lot just miles from Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood. Search warrants for vehicles require judges to be convinced, genuinely convinced, that probable cause exists linking that specific vehicle to the crime being investigated. Judges do not sign those warrants as a formality. They sign them because the evidence presented to them justifies it. That Range Rover was relevant enough for a federal judge to authorize its seizure. What investigators found inside, or what they are still processing, has not been made public. But vehicular forensics in 2024 are extraordinarily comprehensive. Beyond fingerprints and biological trace, modern forensic teams extract GPS telemetry data showing everywhere a vehicle traveled. They recover Bluetooth pairing logs that document every device the vehicle connected to. They pull deleted location histories from the vehicle's own onboard systems. They analyze soil composition from floor mats to determine what terrain the vehicle crossed. They test for fiber transfer between vehicle interiors and clothing. A car is not just transportation. It is a mobile forensic environment. And every environment tells a story. Now add the digital reconstruction layer. Smartphones, cellular tower ping data, cloud-based backup systems, encrypted messaging applications that users believe are untraceable, application location histories, search queries, the metadata embedded in photographs. Every digital interaction a person makes leaves a record somewhere. Federal agencies specialize in recovering records that suspects are certain no longer exist. Deleted does not mean gone. Wiped does not mean clean. The technical capacity to reconstruct a person's digital footprint from what appears to be nothing is one of the most underestimated tools in modern federal investigations. If Tommaso Balbo's devices were active near the Catalina foothills during the relevant timeframe, that data exists. Somewhere, it is waiting. And the geographic convergence of all of this evidence is not spreading outward. It is tightening. The 2-mile radius that investigators established in the earliest days of this case, the radius that shaped the surveillance requests, the canvassing operations, and the warrant applications, keeps producing connections that point back to the same concentrated zone. The gloves, the Range Rover, the searched residence, and now Tommaso Balbo, all of it within that same 2-mile corridor. That is not coincidence. That is a forensic signature. And forensic signatures do not emerge randomly. They emerge because human behavior follows patterns, and criminal behavior, however carefully planned, leaves those patterns embedded in the physical and digital world whether the person responsible intends it or not. Here is what the evidence is building toward. A moment, not a press conference, not a social media announcement. A moment inside a courtroom, in front of a judge, where every layer of this forensic construction gets presented in sequence. The DNA, the vehicle, the digital reconstruction, the geographic convergence, the behavioral record, the investigative timeline, and the silence, that extraordinary, deliberate, official silence, that has surrounded Tommaso Balbo's name since it entered this case. That moment is being prepared right now. But before it arrives, there is something else that needs to be understood. Something about the way this investigation has been managed from the inside. Something about the strategic decisions that law enforcement has made, not just in the laboratory, but in the way they have chosen to communicate, and deliberately not communicate, with the public. Because the silence in this case is not emptiness. It is a weapon, and understanding how that weapon is being used reveals more about where this investigation is headed than any press conference ever could. Sheriff Chris Nanos has spoken carefully throughout this case. Every statement measured, every word chosen with the kind of precision that reflects not just personal discipline, but coordinated legal strategy. In high-profile federal investigations, public communication is managed collaboratively between local law enforcement, federal agents, and the prosecutorial team. Nothing is said by accident, and nothing is withheld by accident. When Nanos confirmed that physical evidence seized during the search of the Catalina Foothills residence was undergoing active laboratory analysis, he was doing more than giving an update. He was sending a signal, not to the public, to the people who needed to hear it most. He was telling them that the clock was running. That is the most underappreciated dynamic in this entire investigation. The public hears silence and reads it as stagnation. But the people who are actually involved in what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the people who know what they did, who helped them, and what evidence might connect them to it, they do not hear silence at all. They hear pressure. Every day that passes without an arrest is not a day of safety for the people responsible. It is a day during which forensic laboratories are processing evidence. A day during which federal analysts are reconstructing digital footprints. A day during which the massive 7-figure reward that Nancy Guthrie's family has put forward is sitting in the mind of every single person who knows something and has not yet decided whether their loyalty is worth more than a life-changing sum of money. Rewards of that magnitude do not just generate tips. They generate fractures. Criminal silence is not a permanent condition. It is a structure. And structures develop weaknesses under sustained pressure. The combination of forensic advancement, financial incentive, and federal psychological strategy is designed specifically to find those weaknesses and exploit them. When one person in a network begins to question whether staying quiet is worth the risk, the entire architecture becomes vulnerable. One conversation, one phone call made at the wrong moment, one financial transaction that cannot be fully explained. That is all it takes for a carefully maintained silence to begin collapsing from the inside. And then consider the border. Tucson's position in relation to the international boundary with Mexico is not a minor geographic detail in this investigation. It is a central operational variable. Federal coordination with Mexican law enforcement authorities confirms that investigators are actively preparing for a search radius that extends beyond American jurisdiction. That kind of international coordination does not happen casually. It happens when credible intelligence suggests that the scope of a crime, or the movement of people connected to it, may cross that line. The FBI does not commit international resources on speculation. They commit them on evidence. What that means in the context of Tommaso Balbo, an Italian national with a connection to this case that investigators are now actively pursuing, adds a dimension to this investigation that transforms it from a local disappearance into something with potential international architecture. If his connections, his movements, or his financial relationships extend beyond the borders of Arizona or even the United States, then what began as a missing persons case in a quiet desert neighborhood has implications that reach much further than most people watching from the outside have yet considered. Now pay close attention to this. Among everything that has been publicly discussed about the evidence in this case, the gloves, the DNA, the vehicle, the searched residence, there is one specific category of physical evidence recovered during the Catalina foothills search that law enforcement has refused to discuss at all. Not minimized, not referenced obliquely, completely sealed from public knowledge. That is unusual even by the standards of active federal investigations. When evidence is so sensitive that investigators will not even acknowledge its general category in public statements, it typically means one of two things. Either that evidence is so directly incriminating that discussing it publicly would compromise the case before charges are filed, or that evidence points towards something about this crime that is larger, more organized, and more disturbing than anything the public has yet been prepared to hear. Either possibility should command full attention, because this investigation is not narrowing, it is widening. Multiple individuals questioned across different stages and different locations. A forensic operation that began with a local search warrant and expanded to include federal genealogical analysis, international coordination, and digital reconstruction. A person of interest, Tommaso Balbo, whose name entered this case not through rumor but through the convergence of evidence, geography, and behavioral data. And a lead investigator who has gone out of his way to publicly clear other individuals while maintaining complete official silence on this specific name. That silence is the loudest sound in this entire investigation. And for Nancy Guthrie, who has been gone for 89 days, who is 84 years old and who is being searched for by federal agents across multiple jurisdictions and potentially across international borders, that silence needs to break. It will break. The question is not whether this case resolves. The forensic weight being built inside sealed laboratory results and classified investigative files is too substantial, too layered, and too carefully constructed to dissolve without producing an answer. Federal investigations of this depth and this resource level do not fade. They build, slowly, methodically, and with the kind of prosecutorial precision that leaves no structural exit for the people at the center of them. Complex criminal structures do not collapse from public pressure. They fall from one decisive forensic break, one recovered piece of data, one traced financial transfer, one associate who did the math on the reward money and decided the calculation no longer favored silence. One genealogical result that comes back from a laboratory and locks a contributor to that mixed DNA profile to a name that investigators can then take to a grand jury. That moment is coming. The forensic laboratories are still running. The digital reconstruction is still underway. The genealogical analysis is still producing results. The reward still sits unclaimed, and the psychological pressure that comes with an unclaimed 7-figure reward grows more intense with every passing day, not less. And Tommaso Balbo's name is now part of the official fabric of this investigation in a way that cannot be undone by time, by silence, or by the simple act of waiting. Through all of it, every warrant, every laboratory result, every sealed finding, every international coordination call, every interrogation session conducted in rooms the public will never see, one truth sits at the center of this case unchanged and unmoved by all the forensic complexity surrounding it. Nancy Guthrie is still gone. She is a mother. She is a grandmother. She is the woman who raised one of the most prominent journalists in American television, and she deserves the full weight of every resource this investigation has deployed in her name. Not because of who her daughter is. Because of who she is. Because she is 84 years old and she was taken from a place where she was supposed to be safe, and the people responsible for that have not yet been held to account. Every search warrant exists because of her. Every laboratory test exists because of her. Every moment of official silence, every carefully calculated word and every deliberately withheld detail exists because investigators are building something strong enough to bring her justice in a courtroom that cannot be appealed away. That is what this investigation is for. And Tommaso Balbo's connection to it is no longer a question of whether. It is a question of when. The forensic results currently sealed inside those laboratory files do not just point toward who may have been involved in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. According to sources tracking the progress of this investigation, they may contain something far more significant than an identity. They may contain directional evidence. Evidence that speaks not just to who was responsible, but to where Nancy was taken after she disappeared from her home in those foothills. If that is accurate, then the next development in this case will not just be an arrest. It will be an answer to the question that has haunted this investigation from its very first day. Where is Nancy? And in the next video, that question gets closer to its answer than it ever has before. Because what investigators have uncovered about the movements that occurred in the 72 hours following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, movements that are now being directly cross-referenced against Tommaso Balbo's known activity during that same window, contains a specific detail so operationally significant that federal prosecutors have kept it completely out of every public statement made since this investigation began. That detail is coming. Do not miss it.